6, 5, 4, 3.
By the end of the 18th century, virtually all the great castles of Wales were in ruins. One or two had been converted into houses, and a few had become sites, centres of attraction for the newly fashionable pastime of visiting ruins. But the rest, they lay silent and deserted, open to the wind and the weather, visited only by birds and rabbits, or perhaps by the occasional farmer in search of a good piece of building stone. The day of the castle, it seemed, was over and forever. But it wasn't. Between 1800 and 1875, some score of new castles were built in Wales. But they were dream castles, fantasies. What had happened was that the wealthier classes had formed a new love affair with the Middle Ages, and that affair had to be played out against the proper scenery, new and specially built. And as sometimes happens, the image proved as convincing and even more compelling than the reality. But nobody, after all, dreams quite the same dreams. I can pick out 3 of these fantasies, all 3 built within the same 50 years, all 3 built to defend exactly the same set of ideas, that is to show power, to show authority, to show pedigree if that was lacking, and of course to be frightfully up to date with the fashionable, picturesque, scenic style of architecture. But all totally and absolutely, completely different from each other, just as different in fact as the architects and clients, both always very powerful personalities, were from each other. And the first of these is Castle Gwrych, built at Abergele on the north coast of Wales. It's a vast, rambling range of battlemented scenery. It is hardly really more than 1 room thick, and it's stuck against the rock face of a craggy little mountain that faces north over the sea. As a castle, it is, of course, militarily totally absurd. You could capture it with a long, hard stair. But it wasn't designed to defend anything but an idea, or rather a set of ideas. But above all, to follow Sir Joshua Reynolds's rule, that there should always be something of scenery in a building. For all its ridiculous absurdity, it does succeed. Indeed, I think it's my idea, and maybe it's yours too, of what a medieval castle actually looked like. Rather beaten up and leaky, and weeds sprouting from the stonework and uneven cobbles, a smell of damp stone and wood smoke, of wet leather and blocked drains, and even perhaps an echo, half heard but undeniably there, of a rough, brawling, noisy, uncomfortable sort of life. It was improvised rather than built by a wealthy Lancashire landowner called Lloyd Bamford Hesketh. And Hesketh was quite a competent painter, a very keen gardener, and he was absolutely besotted with the art of the picturesque in architecture and in gardening. So he planned his castle as he would plan a garden, using the contours and emphasizing the contours or the eminences with building. So he would build, for instance, great retaining walls with battlements, or he would perhaps build a great tower on the edge of a rock so that the tower and the mountain itself became part of one thing. He knew exactly what he wanted, so exactly that, of course, he got rid of 2 architects before he decided to finish the thing himself. Hesketh's choice of architects was interesting. The first one was a brilliant young man called Charles Busby, who was so clever, in fact, that he had exhibited his first design at the Royal Academy at the age of 13, and he went on to write dissertations on prisons and on paddle steamers. We next hear of him in Brighton, where he began carving out a reputation for himself, designing some of its loveliest bow-windowed and verandahed terraces and squares. The windows in cast iron at Gwrych are not his. They are part of a standard range designed for a local foundry by Thomas Rickman. Rickman was Hesketh's second choice for architect, a rather prim young man. He was a Quaker, and he was a grocer's son from Maidenhead, and he had a passion for church architecture. In fact, as a young man, he claimed to have examined personally over 3,000 churches. He was also dotty about toy soldiers and military architecture, and I expect it was perhaps this which got him the job here. But unfortunately, he didn't keep it very long. Building actually began in 1819, but over the years the house was altered and added to, either by Hesketh or by his successors, and of course they used local architects, and I must say it rather looks it. Mind you, it's never been a very cosy house. It faces north, it's gloomy, it's sunless, and in places it's in a really terrible state. But it does have one great internal glory, this great triumphal staircase. It's false, you see, it's a great stage spectacle. It doesn't really lead anywhere or do very much. Hesketh didn't actually build this staircase himself, but my goodness, he'd have loved it. It was built around the turn of the century by his granddaughter, the Countess of Dundonald. Incidentally, somebody seems to have disposed of some of the marble in the bit where it doesn't show, because all this bit here in the middle is concrete. We don't know who the architect was, but I'm pretty sure he was extremely influenced by Beckford's great staircase at Fonthill in Wiltshire, that marvellous monument to the Romantic age. Now, grand social occasions, of course, demand grand settings. A sequence of staircases or rooms as magnificent as Fonthill, through which to process to the climax of the music and the dancing. Well, Fonthill is gone, and Gwrych sometimes looks as if it was going too. But despite its tragic dilapidation, it still has the remnants of grandeur, even if perhaps decay is lurking behind that painted ceiling and the cornice. This is one of the few rooms, incidentally, in which you can see traces of original splendour. That chimney-piece, for instance, looks fine, and so do the carved door cases. But in old buildings, you never really know what lies behind. Like many rich men, Hesketh wished to be remembered, to leave a trail of descendants carrying on the family name. But sadly, this was not to be. In the tiny village church of Abergele, there are panels which have been left to commemorate future Hesketh generations. But they remain blank, and the crest above them a badge of disappointment.